What would you do if a stranger secretly paid for your medicine without ever asking for a thank you? What if that stranger was Shaquille O'Neal? Frank had no idea that the man standing quietly in the pharmacy was a basketball legend. No idea that when he walked out with half the medicine his wife needed, Shaq was watching. But when Frank opened his bag outside, he found something shocking. A handwritten note, extra medicine, and a stack of cash. Who left it? Why? And what happened when the world found out? This is the story of one act of kindness that changed everything. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Frank's fingers trembled as he pulled out his wallet. He already knew. It wasn't enough. Inside the dimly lit pharmacy, the soft beeping of the register felt deafening. The place smelled of antiseptic and the faint aroma of menthol from an open cough drop bag near the counter. Frank stood at the register, exhaustion weighing down his shoulders. His weathered hands, rough with age and hard work, gripped a crumpled stack of bills. The pharmacist punched in the total. A small, sympathetic smile flickered across her face before she spoke. "That'll be $172.94, sir." Frank exhaled slowly, counting his cash. 60, 80, 120. His fingers moved slower as the truth sank in. $128. He was short. His mouth went dry as he looked up at the woman behind the counter. I don't have enough." His voice came out hoarse, nearly a whisper. The pharmacist hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Sir, you're still $48 short." Frank clenched his jaw, his eyes shifting down to the bag of medicine in front of him. It was everything his wife needed. Her heart pills, the insulin, the arthritis meds. Every bottle in that bag was a lifeline, keeping her alive. His chest tightened. $48. It might as well have been 4,000. From the corner of the store, someone was watching. A massive figure dressed casually in a hoodie and sunglasses leaned against the shelves, observing the scene unfold. His posture was relaxed, but his expression was unreadable. Frank sighed, rubbing his temple. His hands shook as he hesitated, then painfully pushed one of the bottles back across the counter. "I'll just take the essentials," he murmured, his voice barely steady. The pharmacist hesitated before nodding. She reached for the bag, silently removing the bottle he couldn't afford. Behind Frank, a deep voice rumbled softly. "Man shouldn't have to choose between medicine and money." Frank didn't hear it, but Shaq did, and his eyes darkened as he stepped forward. Something was about to change. Frank let out a slow, shaky breath, his eyes fixed on the small brown bottles inside the white pharmacy bag. His wife needed all of it, every single pill, every single dose, but he didn't have enough. His fingers twitched as he reached for his wallet again, as if by some miracle more money would appear. It didn't. The same crumpled bills, the same shortfall. $48. His heart ached because he knew what had to happen next. He hesitated for a long moment, then, with a hand that felt far too heavy, pushed one of the bottles back across the counter. "I'll just take the essentials," he said, his voice breaking on the last word. The pharmacist, a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes, hesitated before nodding. She picked up the rejected bottle with careful hands, as if she understood the weight of what he was doing. She wasn't just removing medicine. She was taking away time, comfort, maybe even a chance. "I'm sorry," she murmured, placing the bottle aside. Frank nodded stiffly. He wouldn't let himself cry. He'd spent too many nights holding his wife's frail hands, watching her wince in pain, pretending she wasn't struggling. He had to be strong, because if he wasn't, who would be? He swallowed the lump in his throat and reached for the white bag, his grip weak. It felt wrong. The weight was lighter now, but so was the hope he had walked in with. The soft chime of the pharmacy door rang behind him as another customer entered. Frank barely noticed. He turned, shuffling toward the exit, the bag clutched tightly in his hands. From the corner of the store, someone watched. A massive figure leaning against the shelves, dressed in a dark hoodie and sunglasses. Shaquille O'Neal had been standing there for a while, silently observing. He had seen the hesitation, the pain in Frank's eyes, the way his shoulders slumped like a man carrying far too much on his back. His jaw tightened. As Frank moved closer to the door, Shaq stepped forward, his large presence casting a shadow over the aisle. The pharmacist looked up, startled. Shaq placed a hand on the counter, his deep voice quiet but firm. "Hey, that man, what did he just buy?" The pharmacist hesitated, glancing toward Frank, who was now reaching for the door handle. "Not enough," she admitted softly. "He had to leave some behind." Shaq pulled out his wallet without another word. The crisp sound of bills unfolding filled the air. "Ring up the rest," he said, his voice steady, "and add a little extra." The pharmacist's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" Shaq nodded. In that moment, Frank had no idea that his quiet sacrifice hadn't gone unnoticed. He had no idea that a stranger, a giant of a man, had just changed everything for him. But he was about to find out. Shaquille O'Neal had seen a lot in his life. He had traveled the world, met thousands of people, and experienced more than most could imagine. But some things always stood out. Human struggle, quiet sacrifice, the weight of desperation in a man's eyes. And right now, he was watching exactly that. From behind his dark sunglasses, Shaq observed as Frank shuffled away from the counter, shoulders slumped like a man carrying an invisible burden too heavy to bear. The small white pharmacy bag dangled limply in his frail hands, lighter than it should have been. Shaq had seen the hesitation, the heartbreak, the moment Frank had pushed back one of the medicine bottles. Shaq's jaw tightened. Something about it didn't sit right with him. Frank's steps were slow as he made his way toward the exit. His body language screamed defeat. The kind of exhaustion that wasn't just physical, but deep, embedded in the soul. Shaq exhaled through his nose, lowering his sunglasses slightly. He stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the counter. "Hey," he said, his voice deep and firm. The pharmacist, still placing the rejected medicine bottle back on the shelf, turned with a startled expression. Shaq nodded toward the door. "That man, what did he just buy?" The pharmacist hesitated, glancing toward Frank, who was just reaching for the door handle. Then she let out a soft sigh. "Not enough," she admitted, shaking her head. "He had to leave some behind." Shaq frowned. "What did he leave?" The pharmacist reached under the counter and pulled out the bottle Frank had so painfully pushed away. "This one," she said, placing it on the counter. "His wife needs it, but he didn't have enough money." Shaq's eyes flickered toward the door again. Frank was almost gone. Without another word, Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick stack of bills. He peeled off several $100 notes and placed them on the counter. "Ring up the rest," he said, his voice steady, "and add a little extra." The pharmacist's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" Shaq nodded. For a moment, the woman just stared at him, as if trying to process what was happening. Then, without another word, she picked up the bottle and rang it up, quickly bagging the medicine. Shaq watched closely as she completed the purchase. But before she could close the bag, he grabbed it and tucked something else inside. Something that wasn't medicine. A folded stack of crisp bills. "Give this to him," Shaq said, sliding the bag back toward the pharmacist. "But don't tell him it was me." The pharmacist swallowed hard, nodding. "Of course." Just then, the door chime rang as Frank finally stepped outside, disappearing into the cold night air. Shaq turned his gaze back toward the exit, watching him go. The pharmacist, still holding the bag, glanced between Shaq and the door, as if torn between calling Frank back or letting the moment play out as it was meant to. Finally, she cleared her throat. "You didn't have to do that, you know." Shaq smiled faintly. "Yeah, I did." A beat of silence passed before the pharmacist spoke again, her voice softer this time. "I wish more people were like you." Shaq chuckled under his breath, adjusting his sunglasses. "The world would be boring if they were." He turned to leave, his job done. But just before he could step away, the pharmacist spoke again. "You know," she said, shaking her head, "he's going to figure it out eventually." Shaq smirked. "Maybe, but not tonight." And with that, he walked out, disappearing into the night, just as quietly as he had come. What he didn't know was that the moment wasn't over. Not yet. Because outside, Frank was about to discover what had just happened. And when he did, everything would change. Frank's fingers tightened around the small pharmacy bag as he took slow, weary steps toward the exit. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him. Not just the cost of the medicine, but the crushing reality that he hadn't been able to afford it all. His wife, Margaret, needed this. Every pill, every dose, every bit of relief those bottles could offer. And yet he had been forced to make a heartbreaking choice, to leave some of it behind. He exhaled, his breath shaky. Behind him, the pharmacist hesitated, watching the frail man inch toward the door. She glanced down at the bag in her hands, the one Shaq had just paid for. "Sir, wait," she called out, just as Frank's hand met the door handle. Frank turned slowly, his tired eyes filled with quiet confusion. "You forgot something," she said, lifting the second bag, the one he hadn't expected to take home. Frank blinked. I don't think so. I only took what I could afford." The pharmacist smiled softly, stepping closer. "Well, someone thought you deserved a little extra." She placed the bag into Frank's hands. He hesitated, looking down at it with furrowed brows. It felt heavier. "Who?" he started, but she shook her head. "They didn't want to be named," she said, her voice kind but firm. Frank swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the bag. He looked around the store, scanning the aisles, searching for a familiar face. But there was no one. Just a few customers, browsing shelves, a mother trying to wrangle her fussy child, and an older man adjusting his reading glasses. The presence of the person who had done this, who had given without asking for anything in return, was already gone. Frank exhaled, shoulders trembling slightly. I don't know what to say." The pharmacist patted his hand. "Just take care of her." For a long moment, Frank didn't move. His lips pressed together, his throat tightening. Then with a slow nod, he whispered, "Thank you." He turned, bag in hand, and stepped out into the cold night air. From the shadows of the parking lot, Shaq stood near his SUV, leaning casually against the door. His dark sunglasses hid his expression, but there was a softness in the way he watched Frank emerge from the store. Shaq didn't move, didn't make a sound. He had done what he came to do. The moment wasn't about him. It was about the man walking away, the quiet dignity of someone who had spent his life giving to others, now unknowingly receiving. Frank slowly made his way toward his old car, an ancient sedan with peeling paint and a slight rust stain on the trunk. He opened the door and carefully placed the bag on the passenger seat. That's when he noticed something odd. The bag wasn't just heavier because of the missing medicine. There was something else inside. Frank's brow furrowed as he reached in and pulled out a neatly folded note tucked between the bottles. His fingers, rough from years of hard work, carefully unfolded the paper. Inside, a crisp stack of $100 bills sat nestled within the folds. Frank's breath caught in his throat. His hands shook as he turned the note over, his eyes scanning the simple yet powerful message written in neat, careful handwriting. "Take care of her, a friend." Frank's vision blurred. He let out a shaky exhale, staring at the words as if trying to process what had just happened. A friend? Who? His eyes darted back toward the pharmacy, his heartbeat pounding in his chest. He needed to find whoever had done this. Clutching the note, he quickly turned, scanning the parking lot. His gaze landed on the gas station nearby, the flickering streetlights, the handful of cars parked near the curb. And then, a figure, tall, broad shoulders, moving toward a sleek black SUV. Frank squinted, his pulse racing. The way the man walked, the way he carried himself. Something about him was familiar. The moment realization struck, Frank's mouth fell open. Shaquille O'Neal. Frank's lips parted, his breath coming out in a cloud of mist in the cold air. Before he could even move, before he could even call out, Shaq opened his car door and slipped inside. The engine rumbled to life. Frank took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Wait!" But the SUV's headlights flickered on, and within seconds it was backing out of the parking lot, merging onto the main road. Gone. Frank stood frozen, gripping the note in one hand and the bag of medicine in the other. A lump formed in his throat as he looked down once more at the words on the note. "Take care of her. A friend. A friend." Frank swallowed hard. His legs felt weak, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't quite name. But as the wind rustled around him, as the weight of the quiet act of kindness settled into his soul, one thought echoed louder than all the rest. Whoever that man was, wherever he had gone, Frank would never forget this moment for as long as he lived, and neither would the world. Frank stepped out of the pharmacy, the cold night air hitting his face as he clutched the small paper bag to his chest. His hands were still trembling from everything that had just happened. He had walked in knowing he wouldn't be able to afford all the medicine his wife needed. The thought had crushed him, made his chest feel tight. But now, as he stood under the dim streetlights in the nearly empty parking lot, something felt different. Something felt off. He took a few slow steps toward his old sedan, the exhaustion in his body pulling at him like an anchor. He reached the car and rested his arm against the roof, catching his breath. His body was tired, but his mind was racing. Why had the pharmacist given him the rest of the medicine? Had there been some kind of mistake? With shaky fingers, he peeled back the top of the paper bag and peered inside. And that's when his heart nearly stopped. All of it, every bottle, every pill, everything he couldn't afford just minutes ago. It was all there. Frank's breath hitched. His fingers twitched as he reached in, pulling out one of the bottles he had left behind at the counter. His throat felt tight as he turned it over in his hand, his mind struggling to piece together what was happening. Then he noticed something else. Nestled on top of the medicine bottles was a small, neatly folded piece of paper. Frank hesitated before slowly picking it up. His fingers felt rough against the smooth texture of the note. He unfolded it with careful hands, his pulse thudding in his ears. And then, a sharp inhale. His eyes widened as he stared at what was inside. A thick stack of crisp $100 bills was tucked neatly within the folds of the note. Frank's breath came in short, uneven bursts. His vision blurred as he counted. Hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars. More than enough to cover what he couldn't pay for. More than enough to keep Margaret's medicine stocked for weeks. But it wasn't just the money that made his chest tighten. It was the words written on the note. Take care of her. A friend. A friend. Frank read the words again, his throat clenching with emotion. His hands shook so violently that the note almost slipped from his grasp. His eyes darted around the parking lot, suddenly desperate, searching. Who? His breath came faster, his chest rising and falling as he scanned the lot. A few cars, a mother walking her child to her vehicle, a gas station across the street with flickering neon lights. But no one. No one who looked like they had just done this. Then, a figure, tall, broad, moving toward a sleek black SUV parked near the edge of the lot. Frank's pulse pounded, his lips parted in a silent gasp. Even in the dim light, he recognized the way the man moved. The effortless grace despite his towering frame, the way he carried himself. The way his massive shoulders seemed to block out the glow of the streetlights. Shaquille O'Neal. Frank's breath caught in his throat. It had to be him. The moment realization struck, Frank felt his body move before his mind could catch up. Wait, he called out, his voice cracking from the sheer force of emotion choking him. The figure didn't stop. Shaq opened the door to his SUV, slipping inside smoothly. The engine roared to life, headlights flickering on. Frank stumbled forward, gripping the note in one hand and the bag in the other. Please, just let me thank you. The SUV backed out of the parking space. Frank's legs felt heavy, but he pushed himself to take another step, then another. By the time he reached the curb, the black SUV was already merging onto the main road, its taillights glowing red against the night. Gone. Frank stood there, frozen. His breath came in small, uneven bursts as he looked down once more at the note in his shaking hands. Take care of her. A friend. His eyes burned. He swallowed hard, pressing his lips together to stop the overwhelming emotions from spilling out. A friend. Frank's shoulders slumped as the weight of it all finally settled into his chest. He hadn't just been given money. He hadn't just been handed medicine. He had been seen. He had spent so long carrying the burden alone, watching bills pile up, watching Margaret suffer, feeling the walls close in on him more each day. And now a stranger, no, not just any stranger, but Shaq, had quietly stepped in and lifted that weight without expecting anything in return. Frank exhaled shakily, rubbing his face with one hand. He had never believed in miracles, but maybe, just maybe, he had just witnessed one. Frank burst through the pharmacy doors, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His heart pounded as he clutched the crumpled note in one hand, the pharmacy bag in the other. The bell above the door jingled violently from the force of his entrance. drawing curious glances from a few late-night customers. The pharmacist, still behind the counter, looked up in mild surprise. "Sir?" Frank hurried forward, his legs shaky but his determination unyielding. "Who, who paid for this?" he demanded, holding up the bag as if it contained all the answers he was desperately seeking. The pharmacist hesitated, then offered a small, knowing smile. "Just someone who wanted to help." Frank's throat tightened. His fingers gripped the edge of the counter. "Please," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I need to thank him." The cashier, a young woman with kind eyes, glanced between Frank and the pharmacist before nodding toward the small security camera positioned above the entrance. Maybe they caught him on tape. Hope flickered in Frank's chest. Yes, that was it. If they wouldn't tell him, then maybe the footage would. He turned abruptly, scanning the back of the store where a small security desk sat behind the counter. A modest-sized monitor displayed a grain, black and white feed of different angles of the store, the aisles, the entrance, the counter. Frank moved toward it, heart hammering. If he could just see his face, confirm what he already suspected, but just as his fingers reached for the screen, a hand slammed down over the monitor. Frank froze. The pharmacist stood beside him now, shaking his head gently. "Trust me," he said, voice calm but firm. "He doesn't want the credit." Frank blinked, confusion and frustration swirling inside him. "But why?" His voice cracked with desperation. "Why wouldn't he want me to thank him?" The pharmacist simply smiled. "Because some people don't do good deeds for recognition, sir. They do it because it's the right thing to do." Frank stared at him, his pulse still racing. He wanted to argue, to insist that he needed to know, but deep down, he already understood. Whoever had done this, whoever had seen his struggle and stepped in, had done so with no expectation of gratitude. No cameras, no public acknowledgement, just pure kindness. Frank's grip on the pharmacy bag tightened, the reality of the moment finally sinking in. His eyes burned, but he refused to let the tears fall. The cashier gave him a soft smile. "Go take care of your wife." Frank swallowed hard and nodded. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the exit, stepping out into the cold night, his heart full of emotions he couldn't quite put into words. Behind him, the pharmacist watched, his expression thoughtful. And on the security screen, paused on a single frozen frame, stood the unmistakable silhouette of a towering man in a hoodie, slipping away unnoticed into the night. Frank's fingers lingered near the monitor, but the pharmacist's hand remained firm, gently but decisively pushing the screen away. "Trust me," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "He doesn't want the credit." Frank exhaled shakily, his mind racing. Who was this man? Why would someone go to such lengths to help a complete stranger and then vanish into the night without even waiting for a thank you? His throat tightened as he wiped his eyes, embarrassed by the moisture gathering there. But why? His voice cracked slightly, laced with exhaustion and disbelief. Why would someone do this and not want to be acknowledged? The cashier, still standing nearby, gave a small shrug. "Maybe some people just care," she said simply. Frank shook his head, gripping the pharmacy bag tighter, his knuckles whitening. He wasn't used to kindness like this. In his life, help always came with strings attached, a favor owed, a debt lingering in the air. But this was different. The weight of the moment settled in his chest. Someone had seen his struggle, seen the desperation in his eyes as he was forced to choose between his wife's medications, and decided to step in, silently, selflessly. That kind of goodness felt rare in the world Frank knew. The pharmacist leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Look," he said, glancing toward the door where Frank had just come from. "I know it doesn't make sense, but some people, real good people, they don't need a spotlight. They don't do things for attention. They just help." Frank swallowed the lump in his throat. For the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Maybe the world wasn't as cold as he thought. Maybe kindness did still exist. Maybe not everyone was looking to take advantage. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. I wish I could thank him." The pharmacist offered a kind smile. "I think he already knows." A heavy silence passed between them, filled only by the distant beeping of a barcode scanner and the faint murmur of another customer browsing the aisles. Then the pharmacist straightened, his expression firm but warm. Go take care of your wife. Frank blinked, startled by the sudden dismissal. But as he stood there, the realization settled over him. This was what mattered. Not chasing after a stranger who didn't want to be found, but making sure the gift he'd been given wasn't wasted. His wife needed him. And because of that mystery man, he could go home knowing she'd have everything she needed. Frank inhaled deeply, nodding once. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, gripping the bag of medicine like it was the most precious thing in the world. Behind him, the pharmacist watched him go, a knowing look in his eyes. And in the security footage, paused in the corner of the monitor, a familiar tall figure in a hoodie disappeared into the night, his job already done. The glow of the television flickered against the walls of Frank's small living room. He sat on the couch, a warm blanket draped over his shoulders, sipping his evening tea. His wife rested in bed, finally comfortable thanks to the full dose of medicine he'd been able to bring home. The weight that had been crushing his chest all day had lifted, replaced by a quiet gratitude. He still didn't know who had paid for the medicine, but he had decided to let go of the need for answers. Some things, he figured, were meant to stay a mystery, but the internet had other plans. In a dimly lit bedroom across town, Frank's teenage grandson, Liam, was scrolling through social media when a video caught his eye. "Wait, what?" he muttered, clicking on the clip. It was grainy security footage from the pharmacy. The caption read, "NBA legend secretly pays for elderly man's medicine." Liam sat up straight as the footage played. The video showed his grandfather at the counter, shoulders slumped, handing over a few crumpled bills. The pharmacist hesitated, then quietly removed one of the bottles. His grandfather had taken it, defeated. Then a moment later, a massive figure stepped up to the counter. Hood pulled low, sunglasses shielding his face. But even in the blurry video, his height and unmistakable build made him recognizable to anyone who followed basketball. Shaquille O'Neal. Liam's mouth fell open. The video continued, showing Shaq handing over his card, covering the cost of the missing medicine. The cashier whispered something, and Shaq chuckled before tucking something extra into the bag. The clip ended. Liam's heart pounded. "Mom! Dad!" he yelled, nearly tripping over himself as he ran into the living room. Frank blinked at him, startled. "What's all the yelling about?" Liam practically shoved the phone into his grandfather's hands. "Grandpa, that was Shaq. Shaquille O'Neal paid for your medicine." Frank's brow furrowed as he adjusted his glasses and looked down at the screen. The video had already gained millions of views. Hundreds of comments poured in. "Shaq is a real one, always giving back." This is what a legend looks like, not just on the court, but in life. "I swear this man is secretly Santa Claus." Frank's hands trembled as he watched himself on the screen, reliving that moment from hours ago, but now seeing what had happened after he left. The reality of it settled in. The man who had saved him and his wife, the one who had quietly slipped away without taking credit, was one of the most famous athletes in the world. His chest tightened, overwhelmed. "No, no way," Liam grinned. "Oh, it's real, Grandpa. The whole world knows now." Frank swallowed hard, eyes still locked on the video. For the first time in years, he was truly speechless. Frank's hands trembled as he set his tea down, his eyes still glued to the glowing screen of his grandson's phone. His own weary face stared back at him from the viral video, caught in the pharmacy's security footage, unaware that he was being watched by millions. It was real. Shaquille O'Neal had been the one to pay for his wife's medicine. The towering man in the hoodie, the one who had slipped away without a word, was one of the most famous athletes in the world. Frank swallowed hard. His heart pounded against his ribs. "We need to find him," he said, voice thick with emotion. Liam was already typing furiously on his phone. "Grandpa, the whole world is talking about this. Maybe we can get in touch with him." Frank's daughter Lisa walked in, her brow furrowed. "Find who?" Liam turned the phone toward her. "Shaq. He paid for Grandpa's medicine." Lisa gasped, covering her mouth. "Are you serious?" Frank ran a shaky hand through his thin hair. "We have to thank him. He didn't have to do that, and yet—" His voice trailed off as he thought about the kindness of a man who owed him nothing. Lisa grabbed her own phone and started making calls. Within minutes, news stations were reaching out. Reporters wanted interviews. Talk show hosts wanted Frank to come on air. and social media exploded with the hashtag #Shack the Guardian. Frank's story wasn't just a moment, it had become a movement. Despite the media storm, there was still one person they couldn't reach: Shaq. His foundation had received their messages. News anchors speculated about when he might come forward, but the answer finally arrived in the simplest way possible, through a direct message. Lisa's phone vibrated, and when she opened it, her breath caught. A message. From Shaquille O'Neal. She nearly dropped the phone. "Dad, it's him!" Frank's stomach twisted with nerves. "What did he say?" Lisa held the phone up, reading aloud. "No thanks needed. Just pay it forward." Silence filled the room. Frank blinked, reading the words again and again. No grand statement, no request for recognition. Just a quiet request to pass the kindness along. A slow smile spread across Frank's face as he leaned back in his chair. "That's a good man," he murmured. Liam grinned. "So, what do we do now?" Frank exhaled deeply, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "We pay it forward." The morning after Shaq's message, Frank sat on his front porch, the cool breeze brushing against his face. He still couldn't believe how quickly the world had responded. His small act of needing help had turned into something much larger than himself, and it was only just beginning. At the pharmacy, something extraordinary was happening. Customers were walking in, not just to pick up their own prescriptions, but to help others. A young woman approached the counter, holding out her card. "I want to cover the next person's medicine," she said, her voice filled with warmth. The pharmacist blinked in surprise. "Oh, are you sure?" She nodded. "Someone out there changed a life without expecting anything in return. I want to do the same." The next person in line, an elderly woman, looked up in disbelief as the pharmacist handed her the bag. "It's covered, ma'am." Tears welled up in her eyes. "But why?" The woman smiled. "Because kindness is contagious." And just like that, it spread. A local diner put up a sign, "Pay it forward special. Leave a meal for someone in need." Patrons began slipping extra money to the cashier, leaving meals paid for in advance. A group of firefighters went to a senior center and delivered free meals, telling the residents, "This is on Shaq, and on all of us." News outlets ran the story across the country. One act of kindness sparks a citywide movement. At Frank's house, his grandson Liam scrolled through social media grinning. "Grandpa, look at this. A coffee shop is letting people prepay for drinks, so customers who can't afford one can just grab a free one." Frank shook his head in disbelief, a small smile on his lips. "All of this because of one person's kindness?" Lisa, his daughter, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Because of two people, Dad. You and Shaq." Frank chuckled softly, shaking his head. "All I did was struggle." Lisa squeezed his hand. "And now look what's come from it." As the sun set over the city, more and more people found themselves swept up in the movement. Some donated to medical charities, others helped their neighbors in quiet ways. The world was watching, and the kindness only grew stronger. Frank leaned back in his chair, the weight on his shoulders feeling lighter than it had in years. He didn't need to meet Shaq to say thank you anymore, because now he understood. Some debts weren't meant to be repaid. They were meant to be paid forward. Frank was still adjusting to how much his life had changed in just a week. Every day he saw stories about people paying for medicine, meals, and even rent for strangers. He had never thought a simple trip to the pharmacy would spark something this big. Then one quiet afternoon, the hum of a powerful engine echoed down his street. Frank looked up from his worn-out porch chair, his eyes widening as a sleek, black, luxury car pulled up in front of his modest house. The door swung open, and out stepped a towering figure. Frank blinked in disbelief. "No way." Shaq grinned, walking up the short pathway to Frank's door. "Figured I'd check in on you," he said casually, hands in his pockets like this was just a normal visit. Frank's throat tightened. He felt an overwhelming rush of emotion, gratitude, disbelief, and something deeper. He had never expected to meet the man who had changed his life. You didn't have to do all this," Frank finally managed to say, his voice shaking. Shaq shrugged, his massive frame somehow making the small porch feel even smaller. "Yeah, I did." Frank shook his head, his eyes welling up. "But why?" You don't even know me. Shaq leaned against the railing, looking out at the quiet street. Doesn't matter, man. You needed help. I was there. That's all that matters. Frank wiped at his eyes, trying to compose himself. Well, I don't know how to repay you. Shaq smiled. You don't have to. Frank's grandson, Liam, peeked out from behind the door, his mouth hanging open. Grandpa, that's Shaq. Shaq chuckled. What's up, little man? He held up a hand, and Liam, still in shock, slowly gave him a high five that nearly sent him stumbling back. Frank let out a laugh, the moment breaking the emotional weight in his chest. You got a hell of a handshake, son. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out an envelope. Here, he said, handing it to Frank. Frank hesitated, then slowly opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. For you and your wife. No more struggling. Just take care of each other. Along with the note were several checks, more than enough to cover their medical expenses for the foreseeable future. Frank's hands trembled as he looked up. Shaq, I can't accept this. Shaq crossed his arms. Too bad. Already yours. Frank shook his head in awe, his voice thick with emotion. You really are something else, you know that? Shaq laughed, slapping Frank gently on the shoulder. Nah, just a guy who believes in helping when he can. Frank exhaled, gripping the envelope tightly. He'd spent so long feeling like the world had forgotten him. But standing here in front of this man, he realized kindness still existed. And sometimes it came in the form of a 7-foot legend. The kitchen smelled of freshly brewed coffee and warm toast, a comforting contrast to the emotions lingering in the air. Frank sat across from Shaq at the small wooden table, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened. His hands wrapped around his mug, but he wasn't drinking, just holding on to it as if it grounded him in reality. Shaq took a sip of his coffee, glancing around the cozy home. It was simple but filled with warmth. Family photos lined the walls, and a worn quilt draped over the back of the couch. This wasn't just a house, it was a home. Frank finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. I still can't believe you did all this. Shaq leaned back, setting his mug down. Why not? Frank let out a dry chuckle. Because people don't do things like this. Not for folks like me. Shaq shook his head. That's where you're wrong, man. Plenty of people want to help. They just don't always know how. Frank's grandson, Liam, sat at the other end of the table, scrolling through his phone. His eyes suddenly widened. Grandpa, look at this! He turned the screen around. A fundraiser page had been set up, a campaign to help elderly patients afford their medications. And at the top, in bold letters, it read, Inspired by a stranger's kindness. Shaq leaned in, grinning. Damn, that was fast. Frank adjusted his glasses, staring at the screen. The donations were already pouring in, numbers climbing by the second. People were sharing their own stories, talking about how they'd struggled to afford medication, how they had seen their parents or grandparents forced to choose between food and medicine. Frank blinked hard, his throat tightening. This is because of you. Shaq shook his head. Nah, man, this is because of you. If you hadn't been strong enough to keep fighting for your wife, if you hadn't walked into that pharmacy that night, none of this would have happened. Frank exhaled slowly, the weight of Shaq's words settling in. He had spent so much time feeling helpless, but now he saw it. His struggle had meant something. It had sparked something bigger. Liam suddenly stood up. I gotta do something, he said, his voice filled with determination. If all these people are helping, I want to help too. Frank looked at him, brow furrowed. What do you mean, son? Liam grinned. I'm gonna volunteer at the community center. They have a program to help seniors with paperwork and insurance. A lot of them don't know they qualify for assistance. Shaq smiled, nodding approvingly. Now that's what I'm talking about. Frank felt his chest swell with pride. His grandson, inspired to give back. The world wasn't as cold as he had once thought. Shaq pulled out his phone, tapping a few buttons. I'm sharing this fundraiser. Let's see if we can get even more people involved. Within minutes, the post exploded. Thousands of likes, hundreds of comments, donations doubling in real time. Frank leaned back, shaking his head with a small smile. One person really can make a difference. Shaq clinked his mug against Frank's. You just gotta try. And with that, the cycle of kindness continued. Helping one person won't change the world, but it can change their world.